Hi, everybody. Good to be here. And I'm really happy to be talking to Lauren this evening. So Lauren, I spent, a handful of days in anticipation of talking to you and being excited about a conversation around objects and sculpture and abstraction. And then I had the kind of just great pleasure of thinking back when we first met. So that goes back a handful of years now. It was in anticipation for my invitation to you to participate in Front International in 2018. And I remember vividly being in your studio with Lisa Kersner, who has an extraordinary gallery in Cleveland that you are represented by. You've had exhibitions, you already had an exhibition there, and you have an exhibition coming up in September of this year at Abertoire. I remember being in this about all of, the objects that you've accumulated, how you're thinking about composition, thinking about value structures, and also how I think most importantly, Lauren, to your practice, thinking about the similarities and differences between what is a found object, what is an assemblage, what is a ready-made, and thinking about those histories, particularly in modernism, and thinking about how you are intersleeving all of those ideas and thinking about form. And I really want to have those conversations around form, how you think about organization and order within those things that are so familiar to us that we often don't see. So hopefully we'll get to those questions. Lauren, again, coming to know you and working closely with you for your exhibition in Cleveland in 2018 was a great delight. And getting to work with you yet again in Sculpture Milwaukee last year, coming into this organization as our first guest artist was a delight. Seeing you work here with our foundry, Vanguard, our local kind of mom and pop foundry, are amazing and help our organization out on many levels. But we're also very excited to be working with you on some infrastructure for your work. I want to say that it seems like yesterday you were, remind me, you were at the CIA. So you have a BFA from the CIA, which is the Cleveland Institute of Art. And for everybody who's listening from Milwaukee, the Cleveland Institute of Art is very similar to my ed in terms of having a pretty rigorous undergrad program. I've spent many visits there as a visiting artist, working with different student constituencies. But remind me, you graduated in, is it 08, Lauren? Was it
09?
09, right. So it's been a while. And in the catalog interview with Amy Yo's, Sculpture Milwaukee's catalog, you talked a little bit about your relationship to craft and different kinds of processes in making. And so maybe at some point you can talk about, were those things that you gleaned when you were an undergrad? Were there things that developed? What that transition, because it's been now, over 10 years. What's that transition like for younger artists? Being in school, having resources and studios available to them, being able to think through ideas, working through even, kind of theoretical underpinnings, but what happens when you're out? So hopefully we can get to that as well. But I just want to thank you for being here. And I believe you have a little bit of you can kind of walk us through your process a little bit. You have some images that you developed, and then we can kind of launch into a Q&A. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. Thank you so much for putting out so many details.
Yes, setting up to get there, Lauren.
That was wonderful. That was probably a lot of things that I would leave out. So awesome. Okay. Thanks to Sculpture Milwaukee for the great opportunity to be the visiting artist or artist resident. Let me just launch into some photos. I'm gonna share a screen. I wanted to start with some found object sculptures, but maybe something prior to the Front 2018 exhibit we were talking about. I kind of see that exhibit as a bit of a turning point in how I view my process. And this is just slightly before that. So this is an installation for a gallery show. You just can't, none of the other work is installed in this photo, but it's a group show. But using found objects, considering the architecture and architectural relationships to the found object, to make an installation or sculpture. So I guess for me at this point in time, I was thinking about an idea and fitting an object or some group of objects I had cited previously, matching that up with a site and a scenario, and then, you know, having an idea click and then kind of seeking out the rest. So I think I had seen a giant stash of buckets behind my apartment at the time. And then I had been invited to be in this show and kind of like clicked like, oh, I could use this bucket idea, create a column. And then all I had to do was kind of seek out the remainder of the buckets I would need to get the appropriate height. But a lot of it was, you know, a little bit more premeditated than I might be working these days. And then here's kind of an example is kind of materially similar, but I guess more of a recent process approach. It's like all found styrofoam and plastic cooler lids, sink basin, a small little lunchbox cooler in there. This is more, I guess, closer to my current approach that doesn't necessarily require so much like site responsiveness. It's more open and I guess a process that I can approach like any day I'm ready to, rather than having to wait for a site. And then I wanted to also bring in some of my photography work and talk about how I kind of see photography as like very similarly to as I view found objects, as almost like found sculptures or found opportunities for sculptures or even found paintings. So this is kind of an impromptu sculpture, but it exists as a photograph because there was no exhibition around it or anything. It was just something I saw all these trash cans available in this lot and was able to stage them for a photo. And then here's another approach to photography where I kind of see it more as like a found painting or, you know, a reference to, I guess, conceptual art. But at the same time, it's just part of the infrastructure and markings of utility companies. It's just found imagery. So I kind of think of it similarly to found objects. Or like here, I could see this as like a what is it called? Well, I guess just like a display of paintings in a way, like and some other photography here using other found objects, but with a little bit more intervention. So this is like, I do pay a lot of attention to kind of like infrastructure as well as objects I can collect. So these are like sign holders that a construction company would be using to kind of like do road work or whatnot, with mirrors placed in. So I was thinking about signage and kind of all these objects that demand your attention, but also end up being pushed to the background of your attention as well. And thinking about how those do consume our visual space and infiltrate our thoughts and whatnot, and ways to, you know, kind of shift that space or that platform into an art context, or into, you know, how to put some different imagery in the same context as a, you know, people at work sign. So these are just mirrors reflecting sunsets. This was just a selection from a series. And just a little bit more photography here. It's just a flash photograph of basically somebody's front yard that was completely dug out. I guess they must have had to get all new everything. It looked like they needed a whole new front yard for whatever reason. But there's a big pit surrounded by these cones. And just in the nighttime with just a flash create, it was I found it a very interesting way of navigating space and marking out, plotting out a negative space. So all these things to me really do relate back to sculpture. Let's see. So here is then work from installation for front that we keep discussing. The project I did for that, the concept and the title was called Sculpture Bases. And it actually started with this idea I had just looking around throughout the city and always seeing these like big bases where, you know, maybe a lamp post used to be mounted to and that had been removed, or you know, section of a wall, just like bits of detritus that formed these like massive bases that just reminded me of sculpture and stone, and like thinking, wow, these would be, you know, these make me just imagine what kind of sculpture could go on top of them. And then that kind of turned into the idea of creating sculptures that had a continuance or this verticality that could imply that they could just keep going, and then trying to see if that would trigger a viewer to kind of keep imagining the rest of a sculpture, to kind of attempt to complete it in their mind. Whether or not that actually happens, I'm not sure, but I ended up exploring that idea for 30 something sculptures. And it was kind of a turning point in my process, because I kind of had this idea and had, you know, an idea that it needed to be a certain quantity of these to kind of get the effect. And so I just had to work quickly and amass objects with the, like, basically the faith that it was going to turn into something. So I started collecting and collecting, not knowing what forms I was going to be creating, just with a very kind of generalized idea and some rules and limitations in mind of how to get there. That was kind of just a brand new way of working for me at the time. So I was thinking a lot about, you know, still kind of thinking about architecture and how classical architecture has, I think, a very strong influence on how general population imagines sculptures, and what is a sculpture, as well as just modernist sculptures, and kind of toying with those formal relationships to try to turn these found objects into groupings that would be understood as sculpture or parts of sculptures. And the arrangement, I was also considering the architecture, trying to place things like in a way that would kind of give a sense of being in like a sculpture hall, have things oriented towards the center of the room, but also, yeah. And so this is a following exhibition with Abattoir Gallery. So I kind of had, it felt to me at least like a new way of working, where I was collecting things and then trying to channel this like idea of sculpture, and referencing different signifiers, like basically familiar forms and things that would allow these found objects to as a group kind of shift into the context of art. But at the same time, keeping the objects what they were, very recognizable, very dissectable by a viewer into their components. Let's see. So still all found objects. This is baseball bases, just a complete set, cinder block, some chairs, basketballs, ceramic pipe, cooler lids, and some garden stones, and some thermos bottles, and looks like some planter plates and some old part of a wall of a building, part of someone's yard sculpture, and lots of coffee cans. Let's see if I can get back on track here, what to say about it. Well, let's see. Okay, and at the same, for the same show, this is some of the photography that I was kind of using, thinking of it almost like the environment or the backdrop or the background or a horizon, kind of a horizon for the sculptures. This is like some erasure on a barn. You know, still thinking about kind of almost like found art. They look like potentially color field paintings or Christo and Jean-Claude installation. Or here's traffic cones thrown out, splattered on the street. It's very expressionistic. There's an installation shot.
Lauren, I'm going to interrupt for 1 second because I have
Please,
a
I'm
really
lost.
good question that came in, and it has to do with scale. And it's a complicated question, quite honestly, because I've been thinking about all of the work in these many contexts, right? Sculpture Milwaukee is outside. We'll get there, of course. You know, we used the Vista warehouse for front, right? So that had a very kind of specific context. And you talked about the number of work and their relationship to pedestal and the performative quality of having the viewer build and continue the patterning, the possible patterning or rhythms of those vertical works. You know, here we're looking at a fairly proper gallery with white walls. I'm just wondering if you can, the question was about scale. You know, at what point, what the scale of the work, you know, the objects that are found. I have my own ideas, but I'm wondering if you have something you want to say.
Well, I would say this selection for the gallery was channeling a lot more of like a minimalist approach. Thinking about, I guess, like Noguchi, or just like a small, more intimate interior design kind of influenced sculptures. Whereas with the stuff at the Vista warehouse, it was really just focus on the problem of a sculpture base and thinking conceptually about what the limitations to that are, and how do I make sure the sculpture is a completed sculpture, simultaneously being or implying that it could go on. So it's kind of I guess my mindset was quite different on those. And the space kind of dictated a different scale as well with the Vista warehouse. Everything, it felt like couldn't be so low to the floor. It's just installation wise, to make that space feel like a sculpture gallery or a sculpture hall, which was one of the goals to help achieve the whole effect. It seemed like it required a larger scale, whereas these almost feel like they've been shrunken down from like some like classical architecture in a way. Is this kind of what we're thinking about with your question?
Yeah, no, exactly. I would say that there is still a consistency just by the nature of the materials that you use, right? Manufactured material, right? Cast off manufactured material, often, that had a kind of use value. In this case, whether it's, sports equipment or planters, and all of those objects do have a relationship to our bodies because of their, again, inherent, use value, whatever that was. It's interesting to me because, they may not, a single basketball or a single planter may not have a relationship to a viewer's body, my body, but there is a kind of relationship, not just to height or width or mass or girth. They feel girth. They feel they feel as if they're surrogates for bodies in space. And I really always appreciated that. And it was particularly prominent in the Vista installation in front because of the many, right? I don't even, maybe you remember how many there were, but there were many. And it felt very much like a social group, a kind of gathering, right? As you're saying, you're trying to make reference to, you're referencing a sculpture garden or a sculpture display. I think about various kinds of collecting institutions that kind of gather their neoclassical sculpture all kind of in entranceways.
Right.
Well, that's exactly what we were talking about, and you were making reference to that. But there is something so kind of performative in the surrogate nature of the bodies that you're creating. And some of it also has to do with scale. Again, thank you, Bianca, for that question. But it also has to do with the kind of symmetry, which is so kind of terrific, right? Because our bodies are symmetrical for the most part, right? We have lateral symmetry. We have, an arm on each side, and we have, two legs. And symmetry is really part of the work. And I think that helps me see, in addition to scale, in addition to the gathering, it feels a lot of reference to the body, a surrogates to the body. Lisa popped in and said, yes, the Met or the Musée d'Orsay. And it was the Musée d'Orsay that I was thinking about because I had a young daughter who had an incident in that gathering, and they had to stanchion her off. She had some bad yogurt. So I remember I have an intimate relationship to these, specifically the Musée d'Orsay sculpture garden. But anyways, back to the body and making reference to a young kid in a bodily action. I think that's really important in how you're thinking about the work, symmetry, building. And I'm talking just, this is one aspect of the work because we haven't even got to thinking about formal organizations, but I think it's really important and how bodies, surrogate bodies, objects work in different spaces, whether it's a warehouse, whether it's a proper gallery with white walls, with your photographs on the wall, or different kinds of situations. The first work that you showed, which is a way that I stepped into your work, was so powerful to me because it was as much about architecture, something that you're very interested in, as it was about found objects and its relationship to the posts on either side. And given the context, what I've been noticing in your work is, at some point, architecture gives way to the photographic representation, and that photographic representation can give way to, a different kind of a social situation. And I think that, you're very intuitive to what those spaces can elicit in terms of thinking about how you take that which is so familiar and make it both uncanny and maybe familiar yet again in a different way. Familiar not as basketballs, but familiar as a bunch, a group of
Mhm.
cylindrical cylinders, or excuse me, spheres, right? A collection of spheres. So I think that's fascinating. Again, those are some of my interpretations, and always feel free to, correct me and say, oh, fascinating, Michelle, but
Well, I think, yeah. So what you're saying about scale and the surrogates, I guess I think about the scale and how the scale, each of these spaces we've talked about so far, I guess, demand a different scale for a sculpture to, I think, inhabit the space. And one of the things at the forefront of my mind with these is making these objects into a sculpture, a successful sculpture, a sculpture that um, at least a certain amount of people will agree is a sculpture. Because maintaining them all as individual objects, as I am doing, but also making them work together as a sculpture, is kind of like at the forefront of the challenge I'm trying to fulfill with all of this. And it does, that scale shift. Yeah, each of these spaces demands a very different scale. And I think the symmetry also does come into that. But it all kind of, I think, is just this accumulated knowledge of, and very like pared down, kind of like generic understanding of what a sculpture is. And like, of course, with contemporary art, a sculpture, the definition is very broad. But for, I think, a more and more generalized audience, the definition is not as broad as it is maybe for us, like art colleagues. So I'm trying to work within the realm of like making these things very, I guess, just inhabit the realm of sculpture, which what I'm trying to say is that, the scale is very important. And it does fluctuate based on where they are and how many there are and how they can relate to one another in the space. And especially with the front installation, I think the quantity was also necessary, because I don't think a lot of those sculptures may not have felt like sculptures if they were the only thing in the room. You know what I mean? And symmetry, I think symmetry and human scale are just very common denominators when it comes to like the history of sculpture.
Yeah. And, I was thinking again in anticipation to talking with you, Lauren, a little bit about, I don't know, a litany of artists who have used, found objects, again, whether it's Duchamp and a ready-made and how he was thinking about criticality, or even somebody who I'm very fond of, an Italian artist, a conceptual Italian artist named Piero Manzoni, who, presented as a can of an artist, his shit. It was a can of his shit, right? Now, whether there was his shit in the can, we don't know. So there's a kind of a play there. But, in both of those cases, highly conceptual. Duchamp is asking, deep questions about the value of art. Where does the hand come in? Where does the artist come in? And Manzoni, almost in the kind of playful opposite, if you start thinking about a urinal versus a little can of an artist's shit, you start thinking about, what does an artist produce, or how does an artist produce it, and such. So that's a kind of funny way of looking at, those very tough questions around, what the questions that you're asking in a very different way. What makes a sculpture? Right? What is the basic ingredients to when you're thinking about making a sculpture? And here we have two artists, two very recognized 20th century celebrated modern artists, really asking these challenging questions. And And then there's the uncanny, right? There's artists who use found objects who create a juxtaposition of objects that shouldn't be together, and they kind of elicit the uncanny. A good example of that would be Salvador Dali, somebody we all know, who would take a rotary phone and put a lobster instead of the headset on it, right? And two common objects at the time he made them, but something very weird is going on, something uncanny. It changes our sense of what we think reality or the object should be. Or I think there's some of that in your work, and we can talk about that. But I just wanted
that does go back to scale too, and thinking about how the a sculpture appears from a distance, and then how a viewer is meant to approach it, and how it kind of unfolds as you approach it.
Yes.
So that I think
yes. No, super good, right? Because the little can of shit, that's a conceptual piece, right? It doesn't have any real big impact as an object. It has impact only by the fact that maybe it suspends our belief, or we have to believe that something is on the inside of the sealed can with a signature on top. Same thing with Duchamp, because we know hardware stores or stores that sell, porcelains, or bottle racks. So yes, you're right about that. And as a result, your work still deals with sculpture that does command a visual presence. There's a conceptual presence, but it still commands, it's not, just an intellectual artifact to ask these questions of value that were important to modern art. Something else is going on, in alignment almost with somebody like Carl Andre. You see his slate tiles or metal tiles kind of gathered in grids on most, legacy museum floors. We have one here at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and it's a kind of a formal arrangement, and it's often juxtaposed with another kind of pattern. It reminds me a lot of the photographs you were just showing, but thinking about kind of these formal relationships of predictability or that which is, ongoing. So that formal element, but I often, and maybe as you're going forward, Lauren, I want to just put a bias, my bias, forward as we're talking, and that is, you really are challenging a set of an audience that still values, so unfortunately, after going through the entire 20th century, there are still big audiences out there that challenge the idea of the ready-made, the assemblage, the found object. Their value in artwork still comes from something big and splashy and just, the biggest kind of spectacle. Or they value a kind of hand skill, a technique, a relationship to a skill set that has been, wrought over the years. And, it's okay if I'm in the classroom and having to teach young students, but we still have, a mass of our public still not ready to accept that which, has a kind of intellectual play, or can actually do the hard work. And this is where I get very frustrated, actually do the hard work of thinking about what balance means, what symmetry, what something, stability within a work, how you're building something, the idea of the totem. So taking these kind of formal languages that you're using in organization, and in of the found things you're in color, particularly with Sculpture Milwaukee, how important color is with plastics, and thinking about them, and taking a kind of agency on the viewer's part to start thinking about the formal language you're using and how that gets translated into the politics of the day, let's say. So I say all of that, and my bias is because I get frustrated that, we may know the history of cinema in the 20th century, but we're not, there's this great population who, again, still has an allergy to that which is found, or challenges real, unfortunately, very basic conventions of what art is. What I miss often saying in talking about your work, Lauren, is humor. Like I feel like I have to be serious and teach people all the time. And I just this is an important, this is important work. It's well-founded. This is, she's working within a very important tradition. So I feel like I'm very serious all the time, and I miss the play, the kind of humor that you are able to bring to attention, right? So attention is a very important cultural conversation that we have to have today, as information is, ungraspable as it moves. So you talk about attention. Attention is foundational to your project as you see things on the street, on the curb. You're seeing arrangements, formal arrangements, elements. It grabs your attention, and thus you're allowing us to come into that temporality of how you've discovered it, or kind of freezing it for us. So that's all very important, but there's humor in that as well. There's poetics and there's humor. And I'm just wondering if, before I forget about it and feel like I go down my, come on, Lauren, you're working in a tradition here. This is, let's talk about these things. And I don't have to convince anybody that, again, this is, profoundly important and historical to sculpture, how we think about the language. Talk about humor, and I'll shut up.
Okay, humor.
And Lauren, feel free, if you have other slides, we can let our viewers see other images too. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I think the humor, some of it is like tucked into the art history, and some of it I think is on the surface for anyone. But like in this one in particular, it's a strawberry pot on the top where it has like all those holes and the vines can come out. It's upside down, and it's like very deteriorated, but it looks in a way like a skull from certain angles. So it's like a little memento mori kind of art historical nod, I guess. And then at the same time, like some of the objects, if we're getting back to like the can of shit, like the base of this one, this second from the bottom piece is like a sewer pipe. So I think some of them just by their origins, and then now they're new inhabitants of like the fine art world, that is kind of humor. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be so I guess such a juxtaposition, because even this green pot in the center is probably like a $3 like plastic planter that now all the green is like even chipping off. So it's someone's trash that didn't have like much value to begin with, and then was completely devalued, and now has been revalued.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I think,
Lauren, I just want to point out that's so great with this piece in the strawberry pot particularly. Again, another history is Henry Moore, who was putting bones on pedestals, like bones from cows that were kind of abstracted and had these kind of holes in them, and thinking about forms. So, and he used a found object practice early on to inform his vocabulary. So again, I love that there, because it feels like it's that same kind of play. You find this, and then it has that memento mori skull that you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think it does kind of go back to scale as well, because if we were like 10 feet further away from the sculpture, then perhaps none of the components would be recognizable, but I think it would still look like a sculpture. And then as you approach it, I think the components are discernible for really any viewer, and they can kind of bring their own humor to it as they kind of decipher what the objects are. And then it kind of hopefully turns into a loop where it's, going back and forth between being a sculpture and then, being a lobster pot in the center, and then, oh yeah, it's a sculpture, but then, oh, is that a bird bath or whatever. So yeah, I think that to me, like when I'm choosing objects, when I'm finding them on the street, the objects tend to need to be kind of volumetric in a way, and functional, and the forms need to have some sort of potential. And for me, seeking them, that I'm always kind of trying to expand my capacity to see that potential and to envision them taking on new forms. But so that's part of the limitation. But another limitation that I impose is that the objects need to be discernible. So if I see an object on the side of the road and it's very sculptural in a way, but I can't figure out what it's from, or it looks like a one of a kind thing, then I can't expect a viewer to have a relationship to it and a familiarity with it. And then to me, that kind of disqualifies it from being useful, because it's going to limit how that component can communicate within a sculpture. So here's just kind of keeping with this, like this is kind of more along the lines of like a sculpture garden kind of idea. It even has like in the center, very, very like Greco-Roman kind of inspired planter to really set the mood. And then like even the bottom piece, I love when like plastics masquerade as finer materials. So like that piece at the bottom looks like concrete or some weathered like stone, but it's really just plastic. It just has like a beautiful patina. Oops. This is an installation from last fall at the University of Akron. So kind of like a little, like a monolith, miniature monolith in the corner here. It's like actually the bottom is another part of that like sewer scavenge, and then just a plastic bucket and a top. So the forms, finding just relationships between these like three totally unrelated forms. The top piece, it's some like weird foam fiberglass like casting from, I think, someone's garden arrangement. I'm not even sure what it is, but like I guess I'm contradicting myself, but it doesn't look like a foreign object. It looks very much like a garden decoration. And then the front here is just a stack of, I think, all of them except the second from the bottom. The second from the bottom is an actual stone, and then the other three are different forms of cast concrete, but all found cast, not cast by me. And the top is like, I think, from the foundation of some building, and then I found it in the lake. It looks like it lived in the lake in Lake Erie for, I don't know, a couple of years, and got this like very nice kind of soft edged, like corally kind of look, and now it's a little wishing well. So it's got some water and some coins. Yeah, so really trying to play up the sculpture garden effect there. And cooler lids. I guess I have to say, like, the materials I use are very much influenced, and the things I make evolve with what I'm finding. So like I have an insane amount of coolers, and even actually, gosh, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, so before I was doing so much found object like collecting and working in this way exactly, I did have an idea for a giant cooler and made like this enormous cooler out of other coolers. And it involved like, a lot of construction and hand and, manipulation that I haven't done in a while. And I hated this sculpture and like just avoided coolers for years, which is probably why there weren't any coolers in the front show, because it could not be that I couldn't find them. I think I was just like banishing coolers from my work at the time because I hated that sculpture. But then they came back, I think, just because I can only see something on the curb like so many times before it will kind of infiltrate my design or my ideas. And coolers are everywhere. So this is a wall work. Yeah, it's definitely I think full of art historical references, a lot of like minimalist painting and such going on. And here is kind of trying to figure out the arrangement for the Sculpture Milwaukee show. So this is in my driveway before bringing works to Milwaukee. And this is on the street. So yeah, even though I was reluctant for a long time, when I had the opportunity to design stuff to install for Sculpture Milwaukee, that did kind of shift. If you noticed the materials from some of the previous or some of the middle section there, a lot of those materials I don't think would hold up as well as these plastics would do outdoors. So, you know, limiting some of my material options led me to back to the sculptures of coolers, just because, wow, like it's so easy to find coolers in the trash. I can't even express it. And I kind of do just see, like, you know, my community and what they're discarding is, you know, a major influence. I almost think of this as like data reflecting, you know, the consumers around me. So it, whether I want it to or not, is going to work its way into the work. So I'm back to embracing coolers because it's you know, one of the greatest resources I have lately. These are other works that are downtown Milwaukee right now. You see another couple of coolers snuck in over here. And let's see, there's a detail. So this one is not quite as symmetrical as they typically are, but still kind of playing into this classical kind of presentation. And then these vessels, you know, have their own class. So I think that kind of allowed me to expand out of that symmetry a little bit more.
Lauren, in your interview in the 21 Sculpture Milwaukee exhibition catalog with Amy Yos, Amy asked you a question, and it was to the effect, do you ever hang around your sculptures and try to hear what people have to say, how people are interpreting it, or some kind of comment about, are you ever surprised with the feedback you're getting? And I'll let you answer it before I want to kind of add on a question to that. But I'm just wondering, in any installation processes, especially in such a public arena as Wisconsin Avenue, in the Sculpture Milwaukee exhibition, there is a SWE. Just wondering, kind of what any kind of feedback that surprised you from any aspect of the public?
You know, I'm kind of, nothing's really coming to mind right now. I haven't actually even seen these sculptures installed. I did have to depart Milwaukee before they were actually placed on outdoors. Yeah, sorry, nothing's coming to mind about people's interpretations right now. I mean,
Yeah.
people will, I guess, like attribute forms, you know, say like, oh, this reminds me of this or looks like that. But, you know, not any serious like contemplation or confrontation that I've overheard.
Well, we have some good people who are joining in tonight, who have spent a lot of time with the work and with the exhibition. So maybe they have they've overheard or have some interpretations of their own. You know, I just want to bring up this kind of a paradoxical point between, you know, my you know, kind of argument up front, where, you know, it feels like I'm not defending the work, but having to put the work in context to that very broad and general audience all the time. And like I said, feeling like I have to start with Duchamp and then think about the urinal or the bottle rack, and have that conversation around value and build in this tradition. It was very buoyed when I saw a long review on Robert Rauschenberg's 70s cardboard work in the New York Times, a really, really extraordinary work I've never seen. It's at Gladstone, and I would love to go back to New York just to see that exhibition. And again, kind of in his case, playing off of minimalism, and he's a neo-Dadaist, so kind of thinking about that. But the opposite, the paradoxical thing I want to bring up is, as much as I would love to have a population that understands the questions that artists and culture have asked, the defining questions of modernism, I would also really appreciate, on the flip side, that when we're cleaning up the garage, that we're actually thinking about color juxtaposition with the coolers that we've accumulated, or starting to have a relationship to the everyday. Take some of that vocabulary that you're arranging and bringing to the public and putting it in a lineage, a traditional lineage of traditional classical object making, sculpture, at the same time having us think about that. Not that I need to go to my garage and claim I am going to make sculpture with the stuff that's kind of gathered in the corner, but actually think about storage, think about stacking, think about organization, and think about your work in that process, and actually have these moments where, what does it mean to have a sphere of a basketball juxtaposed with the cube of a cooler, right? What are those geometries? And think about, what they can mean and what their forces are within the world. And actually also with your work, the kind of great empathy of the impact of finding these objects, often cast off. When you're talking about the green, one of the stack pieces where the green was flaking off, Lauren, I can't remember the paint, the green was flaking everywhere, right? Somebody had to paint that, right? That was not, my guess is that, somebody, again, made a choice at some point to paint this pot green. That green, didn't adhere well because it was probably cheap plastic, but it goes through, like, there's a kind of empathetic relationship. And we, when we talk about new materialism within, cultural theory, or new ontology, we talk about our attachments to objects. I think what I really like about your work, it's not, it is bodily. I have an abject response to, the cast offness of your objects, your, where they were found. Some of them may be in newer conditions, some of them, like the sewer pipe, just, corroded and disgusting. But, all kind of working together for a kind of language, a symmetry. And looking back, looking into a history, but also asking us to think about, everything that's around us, the material elements and objects, that which is useful, that which is cheap, that which is valuable, thinking about all of those questions. That I just love your work because it keeps me on my toes. I have to think about, every time I place something down on something else, is there an aesthetic reaction to that? Is it just functional? What is the value of that? Do I really love that mug? So I really want to thank you for that. The work really does evoke that. But, and again, I hope, and this is what I just hope, that a broader audience is able to have those same kind of questions and just really kind of delve down in, the everyday experience of objects that we all have, which is not a relationship we have with our screens, which is always welcome as well. I don't want that to be the last word, Lauren. You're looking at me like I'm crazy. Did we lose?
Yeah,
Lauren?
I know that I just seeing these objects in this different context may just broaden their ability to see their objects in other contexts, or to see alternative, usefulness to something, or I don't know. It, I guess, just hopefully is expanding on at least a liminal level, your potential, the potential ways to see these things, or consider, just consider how you amass things, and do they need to be replaced, or can they be reinvented, or you know, if something can be aestheticized, if something can be fine art, then like, doesn't that open up this broad range of other things that it can be? You know, if it can go from trash to art, then that's like, there's a whole spectrum of other stops in the middle that it could inhabit as well. So those are,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I absolutely agree. We didn't talk about transformation. We didn't talk about the environment. You kind of hinted at that a little bit with the idea of accumulation, right? I just want a couple questions are coming in and a comment, which is quite lovely. I see a majesty and grace in the way Lauren raises up the everyday. I absolutely agree. That was a comment coming in from a friend in Cleveland. And then Amy asked, how has your experience in making sculpture for the outdoor exhibition for There Is This We changed the way you think about your process of assemblage and fabrication, if any?
You know, I guess it felt very restrictive to try to limit the materials to things that I thought would be able to weather the outdoors. But not in a bad way, but in a way that's kind of since been very freeing to go back to indoor options. You know, so these are like materially very limited to plastic, so they do take on like slightly different aesthetics, even though it is really fun to bring in, like this one on the right has that like concrete or like stone architecture kind of effect because the plastic is just so worn. But, you know, I think the opportunity to see them in this outdoor context is the most exciting part about it. So as we were talking earlier about like scale and how that shifts with the different venues, like this is just another example of how the scale and the color and everything kind of has to shift in order for them to inhabit this like realm of sculpture in this context. So yeah, the context kind of dictates what the requirements of the sculpture are, I think. So that's a very interesting. And then just the experience of working with like Vanguard services and the whole experience of building armatures with them, that whole process was just an incredible. It yeah, I learned so much about building an armature that could exist outdoors. So it kind of just opens up a lot of potential for future works.
Well, we're eager to get you back so you can see the exhibition, and you can see this year's 2022 exhibition curated by Ugo Randioni. So we'll get you back at some point, Lauren, maybe after your exhibition in September. We'll figure it out, but we'll get you back so you can see the work in situ.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you for, again, with you know, I want to say the simplest means, but there's a complexity obviously to the work, and again, for perennially allowing me to continuously ask the really challenging questions about not just history, not just sculpture, but, you know, the objects in our life, thinking about order, thinking about organization. And you know, there's a criticality there, but there's also a playfulness. And most of all, I really enjoy going through, thinking about your work and thinking about the process, the attentiveness that you have to that which you find, and how you think about building. It's just a delight. So always good to talk to you, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Your questions really helped this conversation be great. I enjoyed it.
Oh, well, thanks. More soon. Brian, everybody at Sculpture Milwaukee, thank you. And looking forward to seeing everybody soon. Good night, everybody.